Hello, and welcome to this course on Trade and Sustainable Development Goals. This course is prepared by the Asia-Pacific Research and Training Network on Trade, also known as ArtNet. ArtNet is an open, regional network of research institutions dedicated to promoting and disseminating research on trade and development in the Asia-Pacific. ArtNet is an initiative of United Nations ESCAP, the UN Regional Economic Commission for Asia and the Pacific. Thanks for signing up and beginning the first module of this online training. By registering your account, you can now log back in at any time and resume progress where you left off, or review material you covered earlier. This is a narrated online course, so we hope you enjoy listening and viewing the material as we progress. We will also have some video content for you to watch. Each slide plays automatically when it begins. When you are done, just click on the next button to move on. We will also intersperse the slides with some short quizzes so you can check your retention as we go. At the end of each module, there are some optional additional readings recommended. You can use these to deepen your understanding of the material covered. After all the modules have been completed, there will be a final quiz, and if you are successful, a certificate of completion is available to download and print. Please click to the next slide to get an overview of the course content. Before we begin, let's take a look at the overall structure of this course on trade and sustainable development. The course is divided into 3 modules. Each one should take around 20 to 30 minutes to complete. And, as mentioned, there are optional extra reading materials suggested at the end of each module. By the end of the course, you should have a good understanding of what both the new Sustainable Development Goals are and of what role trade and trade policies can play in achieving them. The first module will begin by presenting an introduction to the Sustainable Development Goals, also called the SDGs. We will look at the origins of the new SDGs and how the process of implementing the SDGs will operate. If you already have a good understanding of the SDGs, you might want to consider moving directly to Module 2. In Module 2, we will explore in more detail how trade specifically relates to the new Sustainable Development Goals. In Module 2, we will consider the general links between trade and sustainable development, and understand recent trends related to trade in developing countries, particularly in the Asia-Pacific region. Second, we will examine how trade was integrated into the earlier Millennium Development Goals and whether the trade-related targets, which were part of those goals, were met. Next, we will look in more detail at how trade fits in the new SDG framework, by looking at which goals and targets relate to trade, both directly and indirectly. We will see that trade is ascribed an important role in the SDGs as so-called means of implementation, that is, as an area of policy that can help drive the growth and development necessary to achieve the overall goals. And we will see how trade features directly or indirectly in a number of other goals. In the third module, we will consider how trade-related SDGs identified in Module 2 could be implemented. What are the chances of successfully meeting the targets? And how will we know? In other words, what kinds of data and indicators do we need to monitor progress? The SDGs are new, and much work remains to be done to integrate them into national development strategies. Each country will have the flexibility to define its own priority areas and set national targets alongside the internationally agreed targets. We hope that this course will help guide decisions on what the appropriate role of trade can be in the context of promoting sustainable development. The content should be generally relevant for all regions of the world, but we will frequently highlight data or examples from the Asia-Pacific region, where United Nations SCAP is providing advice and assistance to regional governments. Let us now turn to the first module of the course. Let's now look at the specific learning objectives covered in Module 1. This module introduces the Sustainable Development Goals. We will focus on putting them in historical context and highlighting the development challenges, whether extreme poverty or gender equality, that still persist. To understand the SDGs, it is important to be familiar with another set of global development goals that preceded them, the Millennium Development Goals, or MDGs. We will begin by reviewing the creation of the MDGs and then see the progress that was made towards meeting their targets and the unfinished business that remains in some areas. As the MDGs expired in 2015, countries began planning for what came next quite early. The module will highlight the major milestones in that process which culminated in the creation of the SDGs. Finally, we will introduce the new 17 Sustainable Development Goals themselves and consider how they are structured. We will then examine how the new Sustainable Development Goals differ from the Millennium Development Goals and look at how the process of implementing the SDGs will operate. As we go, there will be some short quizzes to test your understanding. Let's now review progress in relation to a few of the MDG targets. One of the most closely watched targets was 1A, which was halving the proportion of people living in extreme poverty. Extreme poverty was measured as the percentage of people living on less than $1.25 per day. Although it was formulated in 2000, the target was to be measured against a baseline of poverty rates in 1990. In 1990, over half the population of Asia-Pacific was living in extreme poverty, and over a third of the total global population. By 2015, these figures are projected to be just 12% for both the Asia-Pacific region and for the global total. While this still means that there are millions of people living in unacceptable levels of poverty, it is nevertheless a remarkable achievement and marks one of the most rapid periods of poverty reduction in human history. Let us take a look at a further example in relation to the fourth MDG on reducing child mortality rates, measured as deaths per 1,000 live births among the under 5s. MDG 4A set the target of reducing the mortality rate in this area by 2/3, again against a 1990 baseline. In 1990, child mortality rates were worryingly high in many regions, in particular Southern Asia and Oceania. By 2015, rates of mortality have fallen across all regions of the world, and the 2/3 target has been achieved by some, though not all, sub-regions of the Asia-Pacific, with most doing better than the world average. The Asia-Pacific region has also performed strongly against other MDG targets. For instance, nearly all primary-age children are enrolled in and complete school, with students at all levels of education benefiting from gender parity. Further notable success was achieved in addressing concerns of access to safe drinking water. Between 1990 and 2015, the proportion in Asia-Pacific without access is expected to have fallen from 28% to 7%. Again, the target was to halve this proportion, and more than two-thirds of the countries with data are expected to meet the target. Progress against the MDG targets has not been uniform in all areas. Let's now take a look at where the advances in achieving the MDGs has fallen short of expectations. Even though the MDGs have spurred heartening levels of commitment and achievement within the Asia-Pacific region. The region has not achieved all goals, with some sub-regions and countries having made faster progress than others. Amongst the MDGs that fell short are sanitation. The proportion of those without access to basic sanitation fell by only 37%, far short of the 50% MDG target. Around 1.7 billion people region-wide, 42% of the population still lack access to basic sanitation. Nutrition. The region has also struggled to reduce the proportion of children who are moderately or severely underweight. More than 1/5 of under 5 children, 75 million, are underweight. Maternal health services. The proportion of live births not receiving skilled birth attendants fell by 36%, and the proportion of expectant mothers not receiving antenatal care fell by 57%, but still fell far short of the MDG target for universal coverage. As a result, 27% of births occur without any qualified medical attention. Furthermore, many of the most pressing issues facing the world, for instance including addressing inequalities, promoting inclusive economic growth, protecting children from violence, and combating climate change, were not part of the MDGs. Recognizing this unfinished business of the MDGs, it was clear to the international community that a new, renewed collective effort to achieve sustainable development was required. After a short quiz on the MDGs, which is coming up next, we will see what the global response to the conclusion of the MDG period in 2015. We will now move to the Sustainable Development Goals and take a look at how they were formed. As shown, the MDGs framework helped governments and international organizations to focus attention and resources behind common objectives and spurred action and achievement on a wide range of important issues. The framework, however, as discussed, had some weaknesses, and ultimately something new was needed in order to address the unfinished business of the MDGs. The process began during the 2010 high-level plenary meeting of the UN General Assembly, at which governments called for accelerated progress towards achieving the MDGs and for new thinking on ways to advance the UN Development Agenda beyond 2015. The process to define what would become the Sustainable Development Goals and to establish an open working group to develop the SDGs was launched at the UN Conference on Sustainable Development, also sometimes known as the Rio 20 Conference, in June 2012, Rio Plus 20. A 30-member open working group, OWG, was established in January 2013 and included representatives nominated by member states from the 5 UN regional groups, with the majority of seats being shared by several countries. The UN Secretary-General, in consultation with national governments, provided the initial input to the work of the group. After 8 working sessions in 2014, the Open Working Group submitted its report with a proposal for the SDGs to the 68th session of the UN General Assembly. This report specified that SDGs should 1. Address and incorporate in a balanced way all 3 dimensions of sustainable development: economic, social, and environmental, as well as their interlinkages. Build upon commitments already made and contribute to the full implementation of the outcomes of all major summits in the economic, social, and environmental fields. Be action-orientated, concise, and easy to communicate, limited in number, aspirational, global in nature, and universally applicable to all countries. And be coherent with and integrated into the United Nations Development Agenda beyond 2015. 8 sessions of intergovernmental negotiations were held by the General Assembly, and at the final session on the 2nd of August, the draft outcome, Transforming Our World, the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, was presented and agreed by consensus. It featured 17 new Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs, and 169 targets were formally adopted by an unprecedented gathering of world leaders at the United Nations Summit for the adoption of post-2015 Development Agenda, held in New York from the 25th to the 27th of September 2015. The new global goals attracted huge attention from around the world and have generated considerable expectation that the global community needs to meet. The next slide contains a short video which introduces the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. This video introduces the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, sometimes known as the Global Goals. This video introduces the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, sometimes known as the Global Goals. Please click on the play icon to begin. Broadly, the 17 SDGs are no poverty, zero hunger, good health and well-being, quality education, gender equality, clean water and sanitation, affordable and clean energy, decent work and economic growth, industry innovation and infrastructure, reduced inequalities, sustainable cities and communities, responsible consumption and production, climate action, life below water, life on land, peace, justice and strong institutions, partnership for the goals. The 17 goals are accompanied by 169 targets, which are defined as aspirational global targets, with each government setting its own national targets, guided by the global level of ambition, but taking into account national circumstances. The targets are further elaborated through various indicators which focus on measurable outcomes and allow for tracking of progress made towards the SDG goals and targets. Before we take a closer look at the individual SDGs and their structure, let us try to understand the general concept of sustainable development that underpins them. Sustainable development is the organizing principle for meeting the human development goals of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. Within it, sustainable development contains 2 main concepts: the concept of needs, especially the needs of the world's poor, to which priority should be given. The concept of limitations imposed by the state of technology and social organization on the environment's ability to meet present and future needs. Thus understood, sustainability is defined in the terms of three dimensions: economic, social, and environmental development. For sustainable development to be achieved, it is crucial to harmonize economic growth, social inclusion, and environmental protection. The three pillars of sustainability are not mutually exclusive, but much rather can be mutually reinforcing, as shown when expressed as a Venn diagram. They are interconnected and all are crucial for the well-being of individuals and societies. Although the SDGs were partially formed on the basis of the unfinished business of the MDGs and built on the success and momentum of the MDGs, they differ from the MDGs in the following. The 17 SDGs cover more ground and go further than the MDGs. They call for the total elimination of poverty and hunger. The SDGs are universally applicable, whereas the MDGs were intended for action in developing countries only. All essential elements of sustainable development are covered, with the new goals addressing inequalities, economic growth, decent jobs, cities and human settlements, industrialization, oceans, ecosystems, energy, climate change, sustainable consumption and production, peace and justice. A central feature of the SDGs is their strong focus on means of implementation, the mobilization of financial resources, capacity building and technology, as well as data and institutions. Let us now look more closely at two examples of particular SDGs in order to understand their structure and how progress towards them is to be measured. SDG 10, for example, calls for the ending extreme poverty in all forms by 2030. SDG 1 is accompanied by 10 targets. Target 1, for example, is to, by 2030, eradicate extreme poverty from all people everywhere. Target 1.2, as a further example, is to, by 2030, reduce at least by half the proportion of men, women, and children of all ages living in poverty in all its dimensions according to the national definitions. The indicators for each of these targets are, in the case of T1.1, Target 1.1, the proportion of population below the internal poverty line by sex, age, employment status, and geographical location, urban and rural. And in the case of Target 1.2, T1.2, the proportion of population living below the national poverty line by sex and age. As a second example, let's look at SDG 10, which calls for the end of inequality within and between countries. More closely, SDG 10 is accompanied by 10 targets. Target 10.1, for example, is to, by 2030, progressively achieve and sustain income growth of the bottom 40% of the population at a rate higher than the national average. Target 10.4, T10.4, as a further example to adopt policies, especially fiscal, wage, and social protection policies, and progressively achieve greater equality. The indicators for each of these targets are, in the case of Target 10.1, T10.1, growth rates of household expenditure or income per capita among the bottom 40% of the population and the total population. And in the case of Target 10.4, T10.4, labour share of the GDP, compromising wages and social protection transfers. End extreme poverty in all forms by 2030. Yes, it is an ambitious goal, but we believe it can be done. In 2000, the world committed to cutting the number of people living in extreme poverty by half in 15 years, and we met this goal. However, more than 800 million people around the world still live on less than $1.25 a day. That's about the equivalent of the entire population of Europe living in extreme poverty. Now, it's time to build on what we learned and end poverty altogether. We all know how important it is to be in good health. Our health affects everything from how much we enjoy life to what work we can perform. That's why there's a goal to make sure everyone has health coverage and access to safe and effective medicines and vaccines. Since 1990, we've made big strides. Preventable child deaths are down by more than half, and maternal mortality is down by almost as much. And yet some other numbers remain tragically high, like the fact that every year 6 million children die before their 5th birthday, or that AIDS is the leading cause of death for adolescents in the sub-Saharan Africa. We have the means to turn that around and make good health more than just a wish. Now that we understand the SDGs, what they hope to achieve, what their structure is, and how they are measured, let's take a look at what the next steps are in the implementation of the SDG framework. The High-Level Political Forum on Sustainable Development is to be the United Nations central platform for the follow-up and review of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and the Sustainable Development Goals. The first HLPF session since the adoption of the 2030 Agenda and the SDGs will take place from the 11th to the 20th of July 2016 in New York, and will include voluntary reviews of 22 countries and thematic reviews of progress on sustainable development goals. The forum, which adopts a ministerial declaration, is expected to start effectively delivering on its mandates to provide political leadership, guidance, and recommendations on the agenda's implementation and follow-up, keep track of progress, spur coherent policies informed by evidence, science, and country experiences, as well as address new and emerging issues. The forum is mandated to conduct national reviews and thematic reviews of the implementation of the agenda, with inputs from other intergovernmental bodies and forums, relevant UN entities, regional processes, major groups, and other stakeholders. The national reviews will provide a platform for partnerships. Regional bodies, such as the United Nations Regional Commissions, will also facilitate reviews and discussions on progress toward the SDGs in their respective regions. However, it is of course at the national level that the most critical actions to implement the SDGs will be taken. National governments are therefore working to incorporate the SDGs in their own national development strategies with the support of the international community. There will be a continuous cycle of actions, monitoring, learning, and review as we move forward towards the implementation. Let's review the major points that we have covered in this module. First, we looked at the Millennium Development Goals, or MDGs, which were created in the year 2000 and ran until 2015. The MDGs were the first globally agreed development goals. Major progress was made in meeting many of the MDGs. In particular, thanks in large part to strong economic growth in Asia, the number of people living in extreme poverty fell dramatically across the period. However, progress in some other areas, such as sanitation and improving maternal health, was less strong. Recognizing the unfinished business of the MDGs, the international community came together through the United Nations to agree on a new 2030 agenda for sustainable development, which includes the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. These goals differ in important ways to the Millennium Development Goals, not least in that they are universal, that is, they apply to all countries, not just developing countries. To review the materials in this module, there will be a short quiz. After the quiz, you are encouraged to look at some of the further reading materials that are suggested. These are also downloadable from the course page. Having finished Module 1, please proceed to Module 2, which will look in more detail at the relationship between trade and sustainable development.